This is Team Post-Pandemic Dining, and our survey was designed and distributed with the intent of helping guide and direct restaurant owners on customer sentiment and satisfaction entering a post-pandemic world. The data from these results can be useful in guiding employee resource allocation, marketing funds, and correctly messaging our environment and what is most directly important in incentivizing customers to frequent restaurants in person more often, having a comfortable and enjoyable experience. With every question we designed, we repeatedly asked ourselves, what would these results mean to the manager? For our survey methodology, we did an online survey in Qualtrics, and our first thing that we needed to understand was our sampling population, which consisted primarily of direct social connections, so family members, friends, coworkers, people who we have direct relationships with. These individuals were surveyed at home and in the workplace, on mobile devices and on the internet, and there was no incentivization on completion of the survey. As we crafted these questions, we wanted to make sure, since there wasn't any incentive to complete it, that our questions were concise and direct, that with each of these questions we could take the consumer on a journey and not have drop off within the survey. So we used things like an NPS scale for collapsed concise categories, and we made sure to order the questions with the most interesting questions being up front to get that engagement right away. We also did things to make it as easy on the respondent as possible, like adding a progress bar, disqualifying and removing people from the survey as quickly as possible when they weren't a fit, as well as leaving any demographic questions all the way to the very end and keeping them as minimal as possible for what is actionable by a restaurant owner. When asked to rate how much an individual agrees or disagrees with a particular statement, we got some interesting results in that what we originally had potentially anticipated was that a lot of these things might be out of restaurant owners' controls or might be something that would take time to develop. But the results that we were able to get back from our sample population indicated that many of these factors are controllable today, which include things like proper cleanliness of the environment and making sure that it adheres to specified guidelines, as well as making sure that they are comfortable with the rules and regulations in place. Things that we thought may have been bigger contributors, such as vaccines, government regulations, or timing by summer, didn't show up as strongly as factors that were important to individuals as we had originally anticipated. Some of this potentially could have come down to the sampling population and the age demographics, which will be touched on later on in this discussion as well.
For our experiment, we wanted to see if month was a factor in the decision to eat at a dine-in restaurant in the near future. So we set up an experiment to ask respondents how likely they were to eat at a dine-in restaurant with waitstaff in May, June, or July 2021. Respondents were randomly selected to be asked about each month. That is to say, they only saw a question for one of these months. Since we had 3 variables to analyze, we chose to use a single factor ANOVA to test our results. Our results were slightly ho-hum. That being said, as you can see by the averages reported on our table, we found that overall, our sample leaned slightly more toward a higher likelihood of eating at a dine-in restaurant in the next couple months. As we mentioned, we ran a single factor ANOVA test, and you can see how close all our means across the 3 months were. Not surprisingly, we found that there was no statistical difference among our means for each of the 3 months. With our p-value at 0.6, well above the 0.05 threshold, we failed to reject our null hypothesis and have concluded that for the upcoming months, May through July, Month is not a factor in the likelihood of eating at a dine-in restaurant. We had wondered if the later months would have a higher mean than the earlier months, or vice versa, just as we all watch the ever changing news of COVID cases and vaccination rates. But it appears in our survey sample, at least, people weren't thinking of months passing as a factor for them to want to eat out at a dine in restaurant. If we were to do this survey again, we do have a few things we would change. We think perhaps choosing only 3 months was too short of a span of time. If we had asked about wider ranges of a few months each, or even upcoming seasons, such as summer, fall, winter, we may have seen more statistically significant differences in responses. We actually had two experiment blocks in our survey, but we chose to focus our statistical analyses on this question because we felt it had more immediate relevance for our restaurant manager to get an understanding of how much things like staffing allocations and on hand inventory might need to change in the near term. This additional set of randomized questions did provide a little more detail on how people are feeling about dining in at a restaurant in May 2021, and Lucas will take us through those findings in a little bit.
Going through our survey questions, so the first questions on the survey were just demographic and inclusionary. The next set of questions involved the experiment, which we went over in our methodology and our analysis. And then the next block of questions had to do with the questions were about how respondents felt about dining in a restaurant. They gave the respondent a random choice between images and then asked them how they would feel about dining indoors if there was social distancing. The goal of the image in the question was to really find out how people felt or if they were more inclined to dine indoors if there was social distancing. Later in the process, we discovered that, or we figured out that it would have been this would have made for another good experiment if we would have also asked respondents and randomized how they would have felt about dining indoors without social distancing. So asking the randomized questions, how do you feel, maybe asking the respondents, how do you feel about dining indoors with social distancing, maybe giving them this picture, and then the next asking them how they would have felt about dining indoors without social distancing, maybe show them a picture of people dining indoors without masks, and then that would have given us a better idea. But this question still gave us some interesting data. This is the data from the question on how respondents would feel about dining indoors if they were socially distanced. That question was accompanied by the photo that was shown in the last slide. So from this, while this isn't an experimental, this wasn't an experimental question, we can't do much with the data. We can make inferences from it that might be able to help our hypothetical restaurant manager. So just looking at it, it does seem that people are starting to feel more comfortable eating indoors if they were socially distanced. And just from the respondents who were extremely likely or somewhat likely to eat indoors if they were socially distanced. So some of the limitations that we saw with these last couple of questions would have been how we set it up. We felt that it would have made it a good experiment if we would have set up the survey or the randomized questions to show photos of people who were socially distanced and wearing masks versus another photo of people who were not socially distanced, who weren't wearing masks, things that people did pre-pandemic, and really just ask those same questions in a way so that we could have gotten data and maybe run another statistical analysis on it and use this as an experiment. That would have given us data to really take to our hypothetical restaurant manager and shown them how people are starting to feel and really how likely people are going to be to come back to the restaurants. The next question in our survey was how comfortable people are currently feeling about dining indoors. There's a lot, I think, that we can infer from this question. There are definitely a lot of yeses that came out of this, but the number of no's was not insignificant. And while it's not statistically valuable necessarily to this question. It does it does allow for our hypothetical restaurant owner to infer some information. Um, it's a way to kind of predict how people are feeling. A lot of our respondents were from Utah, but not everybody. So if we were going to use this for just one person, one restaurant, I think that it could give some valuable information. If we were going to use this for more nationally, I think we'd have to break down the data more, maybe to definitely have some more respondents. But I think that this is, without a lot of information from this question, I think that we can, like I said, we can infer some points from it. Our first open-ended question was, what makes you feel comfortable dining in a restaurant? So the way we set up this question was, we first had a question is, do you feel comfortable dining in a restaurant? So if they answered yes, we asked them what makes you feel comfortable. And a lot of it is like, people are just feeling that with the vaccination rates, with the protocols and the social distancing, all of the things that our public officials and restaurants have done to keep us safe, like those things people feel like are working. And so that's what's making them feel safe to eat indoors. On the flip side, for the people who don't feel comfortable, the people who answered no to that question, and we asked them, what would make you feel more comfortable dining in a restaurant? And again, it's goes along with a lot of what we're seeing nationally in the news. It's vaccinations, social distancing, COVID. I think we're in right now, especially with all the stuff in the news, we're in a spot where people are feeling that fatigue. They want to get back to normal, but we're seeing a lot of, necessarily maybe steps back as far as infection rates. So I think this, again, it's helpful. It's not necessarily data that a restaurant owner might be able to use to help guide their business decisions, but it is definitely an interesting response from people.
So now we will get into an examination of more specific consumer behaviors based on survey responses. And from this question, we learned that consumers are most likely to return to breakfast, lunch, and dinner behaviors, but there is less certainty around happy hours and late night dining. Then we asked our consumers to do a projective question. So we told them to think about someone in your social circle who is vaccinated, and we asked them to assess how likely they are to eat indoors in the next couple of months. And 45% of them indicated that those friends or family are likely to eat indoors. So consumers tend to think that friends who are vaccinated will be dining indoors soon. On the flip side, we asked them to predict the behaviors of friends who are not vaccinated. And this is essentially a mirror image of the results that you just saw. So 49% do not think that those friends are likely to dine indoors, whereas, that smaller percentage, 19%, would be likely to dine indoors. Most respondents indicated that friends and family are mostly vaccinated. This is a very encouraging sign for indoor dining in the coming months. And what you'll see here at the top of the chart is that 57% of respondents selected a 7 or higher when asked to assess the vaccination status of their friends and family, 10 being mostly vaccinated, 1 being mostly unvaccinated. Now, to help qualify some of these findings, we've included some of our demographic findings. From a geographic standpoint, the survey gathered respondents from 15 states. This was across most regions, with the exception of the Midwest region, which is not very well represented, so something definitely to consider in evaluating the data. This was with a response count of 115 respondents. It's important to note that the data does skew younger. As we pulled the age range of respondents, 44% of those were aged between 30 and 39 years old. Again, just something to take into account when evaluating the data. And then also important to note for the restaurant owners would be that this data is most applicable to restaurants that offer meals between $10 and $30 for individual portions. We asked respondents to indicate that, and we saw most of those responses coming from that $10 to $29 range. So in conclusion, our conclusions from this data is that with social distancing, consumers are likely to return to pre-pandemic dining behaviors in the coming months, especially for dinner. It's important for restaurant owners to know that customers aren't as concerned with time passing as much as they are about vaccination rates. So as they're making managerial decisions, it's important to focus less on the calendar. So it's, not setting timeline dates or goal setting around certain months or days, instead focusing on vaccination rates in the local area wherever the restaurant might be. We think it's very important for them to prioritize dinner offerings and deprioritize happy hour or late night offerings. For instance, if a restaurant previously performed well on that happy hour offering, they might consider shifting their focus, their staffing and their resource energy on something like maybe a coffee offering or lunch offering, because that's what people indicate the higher likelihood of returning to pre-pandemic behaviors. And important to note at the end that social distancing is still important for indoors and outdoors. So keeping those efforts in place will likely keep customers feeling comfortable coming into the location and dining in. But a consideration for a follow-up study might be learning more about the importance of social distancing outdoors. That's not something that we got enough detail on in this study, and would certainly be interesting to learn more about in a subsequent study.
Some key takeaways from this assignment for the, and I'm sure a lot of groups realize this, writing a good survey question is a difficult skill. With practice, I'm sure that we would all get better, but kind of coming into this, I hadn't ever written a survey question, and some people in my group had more experience with it, and so people were better than others, and so it is just not an intuitive, and it's a difficult skill to develop, but one that is well worth it. Kind of anecdotally, as a group, I don't want to talk about how much time it took, but we took a lot of time to decide on how we were going to define restaurant for our survey, and really making that definition understandable by all of our respondents. The next takeaway was that just with more time, if we could have had a test group to almost beta test the survey, that would have been invaluable just to really work out the kinks. I think looking at a survey, doing it over and over again, and really writing it, I think it's easy to become myopic with those. And then lastly, choosing the right statistical analysis it's imperative. And I think with more practice, definitely it gets easier, but it is not something going into this that we thought that would be as difficult as it was for us. It did take some time for us. So that's all we have for our presentation. We hope you enjoyed our research. Thank you.